I want to say I saw it coming, but the truth is I was half asleep myself, one hand hanging down under the desk to scratch behind Bram's ear while Professor Drevis worked through his slides. Xenology 400 met at 8 in the morning station time, which on Austria meant a sky the color of wet slate through the dome, the recycled air still carrying the smell of whatever the cafeteria had burned for breakfast 3 decks up. Nobody in that lecture hall was awake except the professor. Most mornings I wasn't even sure Bram counted as present so much as delivered. I'd walk him in on the leash, he'd find the patch of floor under my desk that got the most warmth off the heating grate, and that was the extent of his academic participation for the day. I'd brought him to the Calyx Institute the way you bring an old piece of furniture you can't imagine the house without. He'd been my grandfather's dog first, technically, but Bram had only ever considered himself mine from the day I was old enough to feed him. When the accreditation board approved my transfer off-world, they'd approved him too, filed under companion support allowance, and neither of us had thought twice about it since. He slept through decontamination cycles, he slept through the shuttle burn. He was, by any measure the Institute cared to apply, a low-maintenance, thoroughly unremarkable animal. Drevis was slate-skinned himself, tall in the way all his people were tall, with a voice that carried without him raising it. He'd built his whole career on a single argument, and he liked to open with it fresh for every new class, that the galaxy's fear of Earth was manufactured, that the so-called deathworld reputation, the strength, the aggression, the animals bred to survive a planet trying to kill them daily, was propaganda, dressed up by Earth's diplomatic corps to buy leverage at the negotiating table nobody outgunned them at otherwise. He had 3 decades of published papers behind that position and, as far as I could tell, not one of them had ever met an actual Earth animal before that morning. Case in point, he said, and the pointer light landed on my desk. On Bram. Bram was 140 pounds of gray-muzzled English Mastiff, flat on his side with all 4 legs out like he'd been poured there, snoring softly enough that only the first row could hear it. He was registered as my support animal, old service injury, long story, and the academy let him lie under my desk through every lecture, where he had done exactly nothing remarkable for 4 months running. Behold, Drevis said, Earth's apex companion, a sedated, overweight terrestrial mammal that requires a human to open his own food container. A few of the alien cadets laughed, the polite kind, the kind that isn't cruel so much as certain. I didn't say anything. Bram didn't say anything either, on account of being asleep. I don't dispute that Earth produces large animals, Drevis went on. I dispute that they are what the propaganda claims. So today, a genuine demonstration of threat physiology. For contrast, he nodded to the 2 lab assistants at the door, and they wheeled in a transport crate the size of a supply locker, reinforced glass on one side, warning strobes already cycling amber. Inside was a cadet. I'd only seen hollows of them before, juvenile, maybe 18 months by their reckoning, from one of the outer rim worlds where everything above the waterline had teeth. It was already up on all 6 limbs, scraping at the glass, throat working through a sound that hit somewhere under my sternum, before my ears even caught up to it. The 2 assistants kept their distance from the crate like men used to keeping distance from that crate, and the strobe on its housing was already cycling amber, the color that meant the containment protocol assumed the worst by default. Drevis had brought a cadet specifically, he explained, because their threat displays were among the most studied in the department, reflexive, involuntary, present even under partial sedation, the closest thing xenobiology had to a control sample for authentic deathworld aggression. A few cadets in the front row leaned forward. The lanky kid from the Huntercast world 2 seats down from me pulled out a stylus to take notes, which told me he expected this part to matter. This, Drevis said, raising his voice slightly for the first time all morning, is what real deathworld physiology looks like. Watch the reflex threat display. This is instinct, not myth. The cadet went quiet. Not calm quiet, not tired quiet. It stopped scraping mid-motion, one limb still raised, and its whole body dropped an inch lower, like something had reached in and turned a dial. Its head swung toward my desk, toward the floor under it, nostrils working the air through the crate's vents. Then, it folded down flat against the glass, ears back, tail tucked so far under itself it looked like it didn't have one anymore, and it made no sound at all. None. For a room that had been listening to it snarl 15 seconds earlier, the silence had weight. Drevis stopped talking. Bram, for the record, had not moved. He huffed once through his nose. That specific, put-upon huff he did when I moved my feet too much, cracked one eye at the general vicinity of the crate, decided it wasn't worth getting up for, and went back to sleep. Nobody laughed this time. One of the alien cadets in the second row, a lanky kid from a hunter caste world who'd have recognized a submission posture faster than anyone else in the building, said it out loud before Drevis could stop him. It's reading him as a superior. It's reading a house pet, Drevis said, but his voice had lost the certainty from 10 minutes ago. He crouched by the crate himself, studied the Kesset's flattened ears, the tucked limbs, the refusal to make eye contact with anything in the room. Kesset's didn't do that. Kesset's didn't do that for anything. I'd looked it up later, actually. Their threat displays were supposed to be involuntary, hardwired, impossible to suppress even under sedation. This one had gone still enough that the strobe on its crate switched from amber to a slow green, the setting for containment not required. Drevis looked at Bram a long moment. Looked at me. Wake him, he said. He's an old dog, Professor. He's not much for demonstrations. I'm not asking for a demonstration. I'm asking you to wake him up. So I did, gently, the way you wake a 140-pound animal who's earned the right to be woken gently. Bram lifted his head, blinked at the room full of alien cadets staring at him like he'd grown a second head, glanced once at the crate, barely a glance, the kind you give a noise outside that isn't your problem, and then looked back up at me with an expression that plainly asked whether it was time for lunch yet. The Kesset hadn't moved the entire time, hadn't so much as adjusted the angle of its ears. Drevis had the assistants wheel the crate back out early, the strobe still holding steady green the whole way to the door, and even after the Kesset was gone, the room stayed quiet in a way it hadn't been all semester. He didn't finish that morning's lecture as written. Instead, he stood at the podium for a long moment, with his slides still cued to the next section, Comparative Aggression Indices. The header read, in a font that suddenly looked a little foolish, and then he set the pointer down and started talking without it. He spent 20 minutes revising his own theory out loud, in front of us, which I think cost him more than the theory itself had. A man who's built his whole career on an argument doesn't enjoy watching a napping dog dismantle it before 9 in the morning, and to his credit, he didn't try to talk his way around what we'd all just watched. He used words like olfactory hierarchy signaling, and unconscious deference cues, and further study required, circling the plain fact without quite landing on it, and every cadet in that room could tell he was rebuilding the sentence in real time to leave himself an exit. The hunter caste kid raised his hand once, started to say something about submission postures again, and Drevis actually let him finish this time. That was new too. Nobody in the hall said the word propaganda again that semester. He kept teaching the class. He was a good professor, underneath the theory, methodical and fair with his grading even when a lecture went sideways on him, and I never held the theory against him once he'd let it go. But the syllabus got quietly revised over winter break, and I heard from a second year the following spring that the new reading list included an actual case study on companion animal threat recognition. First time in the department's history. I like to think somebody in that department eventually had to write Bram's name into a citation somewhere, filed under species Canis familiaris, disposition, unremarkable, and never once knew how much weight that last word was carrying. Bram never did figure out he'd done anything. As far as he was concerned, an unpleasant smell had come into the room, made a fuss, and gone away again, and none of it was worth losing a nap over. I used to try to explain it to him on the walk back to the dorms. You're famous now, you know that? And he'd just look up at me, tongue out, gray muzzle catching the dome light, entirely unbothered by his own legend. He's older now, grayer around the eyes than he was that semester. He still sleeps through most things. I've learned not to read anything into that anymore. I've learned the ones worth watching are the ones who don't feel the need to prove it.